you? My name's Larkin Ford. I do a lot of drawing and painting. I teach a variety of classes at Georgia State, some painting classes, a lot of drawing one, some intermediate drawing, life drawing once in a while. And I've done some sequential art, comic books in the past, and that was sort of how I first grew to love visual art as a kid, was reading Calvin and Hobbes and then X-Men comics, stuff like that. Then looked back through art history and so on into contemporary art. So multi-image storytelling has a really rich history. I think we sometimes think of it as necessarily for kids, but it doesn't have to be the case. So children's books, sure, comic books, newspaper comic strips, but also storyboards for films. A lot of movie cinematography starts as simple drawn images. Fresco cycles in cathedrals, where they were designed to be clear and communicative for an audience that was only some of which was literate. Book illustrations, there are just some wonderful book illustrations over the years. And the Bayeux Tapestry is another example, this huge tapestry that tells an epic saga. Why video? So we've got visuals, multiple images in sequence, that's its own thing. But why do this thing with still images but manipulated into a video? Well, I think you get expanded visual possibilities with it. You can get motion within a still image. So anybody who's seen a Ken Burns documentary is all too familiar with the idea of a photograph that is panned across or zoomed into while there's music playing and narration over it, and it gives a little bit more texture to the whole experience without necessarily having to use moving images. There's also the ability to do color shifts and other changing visual effects. Some of those I can find a little bit distracting, like crazy wipes between one image and another. So I don't use a lot of it, but I think it's great to bear that in mind as a possibility. And also transitions between two still images can be subtle or very stylized, but the color shifts within it, that can happen over time. As far as why audio, well, think about if you're looking at a still image of a dock and you hear water sloshing or something like that, it can help immerse you in that. Like, I think using other senses as opposed to just the eyes. We're very, very vision dominant culture, but it can be really nice to use sound, not just for narration, but for other things. So we got public domain instrumental music, or if you play a little bit of piano or something, I think laying some of that down could be really, really useful to support the emotional tone of whatever you're going to get across. Speech, narration, and dialogue, whether it's scripted or whether it's improvised, a lot of things are difficult to get across quickly and clearly in an image, but you can, like somebody's interior life, if you think about a novel, a lot of the stuff is people's thoughts rather than explicit action taking place, and it would be almost impossible to visualize certain things. Foley, if that's a new word for some of you, that's just sort of in movies when people use practical effects to get sounds, like to use half a coconut to clop on the ground and get the sound of hoofbeats for a horse scene, or, footsteps in gravel. They'll actually have a little thing of gravel in the sound studio. Let's think about it in comparison with traditional film. I think accessibility is one of the things that's nice about doing some drawings and then adding some things to them in the video. So with still illustrations, rather than animation or live action, it leaves a bit more room for viewers' imaginations to fill in the gaps. And it's also a more accessible way to work, since you don't need a huge budget, professional lighting and actors and so on. Animation, with about 24 drawings a second, it's absurd the amount of time that goes into it. And even if you want to do your own sort of cut corner form of animation, like I do a little bit of it from time to time, and it's like even 15 frames, which isn't as fluid, it still takes a ton of time. So letting one image do a lot of the talking can be really nice. So all this is the talk about the form, but what is a story worth telling? How do you begin? How do you get this off the ground? So you can apply this format, or you can fill this format with just about any content that you would like to. For a narrative, here are some suggestions. You could think about, what are some events in your life, large or small, that have had an impact on you? This can be years ago. This could be something that happened this week and that feels memorable. And there's no pressure to make it profound or entertaining in the usual sense. I think sometimes folks feel a pressure to provide the audience with a punchline of some kind or a big emotional payoff. I think sometimes real life doesn't work that way, and I would just focus on honesty in the end. There doesn't have to be like a huge reveal or something dramatic in that way. Visuals and text. So you can start by writing a loose outline. and think about how can you sculpt this into a loose narrative structure with a beginning, middle, and an end. Will there be narration over it? Will there be dialogue between characters? Even if your story is going to be totally wordless, like a silent film kind of thing, at this stage, you can describe to yourself what's going to happen. Like this is just an example of a storyboard that I found online where we have little notes to self, and that allows the drawings to be more loose and more just concerned with how the shapes fit together. If it's a really zoomed in image, like there with the cigarette, second down on the left, it's like, oh yeah, I don't have to do a great job of rendering a hand holding a cigarette. I can just say, oh, that's what this is, and it does some of the work for you. I think writing it like you're writing a play, especially if you feel more at home with words than with images, that can be excellent. Just like describe the scene and do it that way. So here's how I started my story. I was working on some sort of family narratives and stuff, and a lot of it wasn't feeling as visually rich as I wanted. Then I had a weird dream and thought, that's not quite fiction. And if it were, that's all right too. But just telling a dream to somebody can sometimes feel lackluster, like you don't quite get across what you wanted. So I thought it was interesting and worth giving a shot. So I had a dream about being tied to the rafters of a post office. It wasn't really scary. I was sort of all right with it, and time was just passing really slowly. So I talked into the voice memo app on my phone, trying to recall what I could. Happened in this little foggy seaside town. And I don't know, maybe some of you have had dreams where it feels like everything is slowed down or your legs are turned to rubber a little bit if you're trying to run from something. It was a little like that, but it was just more real slow and sort of a boring pace to it. So I transcribed that into a sketchbook, added some real loose, rough drawings, and a storyboard is a sequence of drawings, typically with some directions and dialogue, representing the shots planned for a movie or TV production, but it's also really useful for us here. So here's mine, and it's sort of a hot mess. You can see it's just like words down the middle, and then I ended up adding things. So that's why there's the little branches between them telling me what order to read it in. And reworking things early to save time, I think, is really useful. So whether you want to shoot a live action short film, animated cartoon, or do a series of drawings set to music, plan it out in a quick, unfussy way. Make your big mistakes here rather than after you've put a lot of time into a precious drawing. So as you're planning, you can envision the final product, think about how you'll make it happen. I think sitting with your eyes closed can actually be really, really helpful. Just try to vividly imagine this thing unfolding in front of you in the way that you would envision it, the perfect version. And we always fall short of that, but it's okay. I think we get closer by focusing on envisioning it vividly. The way that I would actually recommend you to do is to have, scene, then you've got your box there, and then the description underneath it. This is a more organized way to work. I think it's a good way to start. And often I'll make the big messy round and then pop them into something more like this. So the more iterations you've got, the more time you've got to build something up, the more you can be organized with it. So you can read it through, have your friends read it through and mark it up if you got time, or even while you're reading it out, people can give notes. So do your best to imagine the finished experience. Are there areas you can afford to cut? Are you communicating the story clearly? So think about, is there something that I need to take out and it would make the rest of it cling together better? Maybe there's something that actually happened on the same day, but maybe it's not relevant to this story. And maybe there's something that feels obvious to you because you know this family member or whatever, but that wouldn't be obvious to a friend who didn't know them. So I think it's really, really good, especially when you're close to the subject matter, to get a couple readers with a different perspective. They might catch things you didn't. So then we get to the phase of drawing and painting the images. And this approach that I'm going to show you is only one of many, many potential approaches, but I hope that you find some of these tools useful to you. So when you begin the drawing, I think it's a good idea to start very light and very loose. Once I've got my rough storyboard laid out, I'll sketch things from imagination, but I'll also look for photo reference as needed. I place the elements in there so that they make sense together. And again, I'm not just making this up. I'm going from those small, messy drawings. Then I find reference for what I need. And one thing that you can do is set down the video camera on video mode and actually enact the stuff, like hit record, lean it up against something, enact the stuff, and then take a screenshot for photo reference. I find that it really helps. If you can spend all day looking through Google image search for somebody making just the right expression with the right hand gestures. if you mimic it yourself, you can get there a lot faster. Adding specificity. This is a sample image from an urban sketcher group, which is like plein air painting. Once I know where things are going, I can look up images, or better yet, take photos myself to help me complete the pencil stage. I can also use the rules of perspective to make architecture believable. Inking to create a visual rhythm. There are many beautiful approaches to inking, but here are a few ideas that'll serve you well. This is a Heinrich Kley drawing. I think he's one of the true masters of ink drawing that we've ever seen. Thicker lines up close, thinner lines in the distance. You can see this with the dancing elephants. As silly a choice of subject matter it is, it's got a little bit more weight because he knows something about elephant anatomy, for one thing, but also he's got thicker, bolder lines with the elephant that's closer to us, a little bit lighter and hazier in the elephant that's just a few feet farther away. I think it's a good idea also to use large movements. So instead of making a bunch of tiny, finicky movements to get the edge of something, it's okay if you don't get it quite right, but try to get it down in one big sweep. And you can look at ink drawings you love and focus on how they use variation. So thick to thin lines, big pools of black ink for shadows, cross-hatching for texture like we see here. And depending on how realistic you're interested in going, this might be easier or harder. But I think it's also just fine to start where you are, as far as if you've got something you want to share and you don't feel like your drawing skills are there, that shouldn't stop you from doing it. I think still just give it a good go. I've got a little video that goes over the process of drawing this stuff. Let me share that. I got to just switch my share real quick. Cool. Here we go. I'm just going to talk over it because I made it silent. So here we go with the thumbnail sketches, rough, loose descriptions, rough, loose images. Even using color at this stage is optional. I think just thinking in terms of light and dark is also just fine. Sometimes if I've got a color idea, then it'll help to lay it down. You can use a ruler to make rectangles twice as wide as they are tall if you're just going to shoot it straight up. So the aspect ratio of the screen is 1920 wide by 1080 pixels tall. We can make taller images if we want to pan up, like looking up just like the camera just did there. And I've got unfinished work all around the studio, and so I think it can especially help if you got multiple half-finished images, bring them up together with one another rather than totally finishing one out before you even touch the next one. So first off, we're thinking, does the image tell the story? We'll worry about the little stuff, the details later, of making sure that the anatomy makes sense. So I like to get pretty far without even using a photo. You can alter what you see as well. Like, these characters don't look that much like me, but I'm able to alter what I see. And I'm constantly moving stuff around. Here's an example of linear perspective happening in that the way those boards were receding away. Now with line, I think there are a lot of ways to go about it. One thing that I really do recommend is trying to get energy into it by using fairly big motions. Like you'll see whenever I sweep down the arm, I'll treat the whole forearm at once. And sure, for the beard, it's a lot of little scruffy marks, but it's with an understanding of like, oh yeah, there's a jaw that knits this thing together. I think that having big swooping motions can help something feel a little less labored over, a little more unified. So these figures in the background, I'm actually using green ink. It's a little tough to see in the video, but it's a thinner line and a paler color of ink, and so the higher contrast stuff comes toward us, thicker lines come toward us, thinner lines, and especially lines that are not black ink will recede a little bit. You can see that happening there. So once we're moving into the paint phase, we can think about color, and complementary color is a good go-to, which is just grabbing two colors directly across the color wheel from one another, so you get this high contrast quality to it. So blue and orange feel very vibrant together, yellow and violet, or green and red. And one thing is that you can use one of those colors very muted. I think depending on your sensibilities, you might want it to be a little more low-key and not just like really, really bold, straight out of the tube type colors. So if it's a very bright red, you might use a dull green with it, so it doesn't feel too Christmassy, for instance. Analogous color is another way to go, using colors that are neighbors with one another. So if we think of it as a slice of pie where we cut in, oh, okay, maybe we got red, violet, red, and red, orange together, and those are unified in a different way. And we've still got warms and cools. So I think it's really helpful to always have some colors that feel a good deal warmer than others within your color palette. You can use a limited color palette, and sometimes my philosophy on it is if the drawing is going well, then I just need to not mess it up with the color. If I can say, what's a way that I can keep the color a little bit subdued? I think one way where it's hard to go wrong is just a warm color, a cool color, black and white. So this image here is just painted with black, white, yellow, and blue. And so you get pretty good little variety of warm and cool, light and dark. And then the blue is actually fairly dull, but it feels lively enough for my eyes. Sorry about the low quality of that image there. That painter is actually great. His name's Neo Rauch, the German painter. But subjective color can reflect emotion. So if we're telling a story that has to do with the emotional state rather than exactly how things went down in a realistic way, then using way more limited color palettes or just really unexpected color palettes can be nice. So we might associate red with anger, or we might have other associations like orange light from the side might remind us of a late afternoon sun, certain kind of lazy, relaxed vibe that goes with that. And even when you're thinking in terms of emotion, it can still help me to use the color wheel. I think that some of that stuff can feel really dry and rules oriented, and feels like a lot of restriction and right and wrong. I think just use it as a tool as much or as little as you need or desire to. So watercolor, this is not necessary for this. I think if you prefer letting the images be black and white, awesome. If you would rather use colored pencil so you can get a little bit more control, sweet. If you like coloring things in digitally after scanning in ink, that's great as well. But this is how I went into it, so I thought I'd talk about it a little bit. One saying that I like a lot is that learning to use pencil is like training a dog, but using watercolor is like trying to train a cat, which is to say it runs in a puddle and it sort of behaves the way it wants to behave. So if you want to get along with your cat, it's more about understanding how they're going to act than about trying to put them on a leash. So watercolor, and again, personal taste. This might not be the way that you'd like to use it or the type of imagery that appeals to you, but I like when there's a little bit of freedom in the watercolor, and we can see it as being just fluid material, and we can see it as congealing into this scene at the same time. So there's a bit of a balance there. And this is a zoom in of one of the dock paintings that I did for this video.